How to create a great mixing template in Logic Pro X, Part 2! So this is Part 2 on how to create a great mixing template in Logic Pro X. If you haven't watched Part 2, you can find it in the video description. So I want to talk about the importance of creating groups. So what this means is that you're controlling multiple tracks from one single track, one group track. This can be very useful when you're mixing drums, for example, where you have a snare drum, 2 kick drums, 3 tom-toms, overheads, etc. Or if you have several tracks for backup vocals. It will be more efficient to apply EQ, compression, sound effects, etc. on one track, rather than process every track separately. So as you can see, I've grouped all of the drum tracks where I have EQ, etc. The input on the bus track is set at bus 1, and the output of the tracks that I want to send to bus 1 is set to bus 1. So for instance, if I make an EQ adjustment on my bus track, it will affect all of my drum tracks. So if you feel like the drums overall lack brightness, for example, you can tweak the EQ on your group track. Or if you want the drums to be more sort of glued together, you can use a compressor. So needless to say, using group tracks is a great way to improve your workflow. Let's talk about your plugin setup. To maintain a seamless mixing process, I suggest creating a setup of plugins for each channel. As you can see, I have a ton of plugins prepared on my channels, mainly EQ and compression. Why? Well, EQ and compression are essential plugins when mixing, and it's therefore important that you have fairly smooth access to these when mixing. I suggest adding an EQ and a compressor to each channel that you have. As you can see, I have these plugins on standby on pretty much every channel. So if you have a recorded guitar track, you'll have quick access to an EQ and a compressor, which you will most likely need when mixing. They're designed slightly differently depending on the channel, and they are all just as sort of general guidelines. So for example, on my channel for vocals, I have a couple of de-essing plugins to reduce sibilance. My compressor settings on acoustic guitars differs from my compressor on my electric guitars. I've also added a I/O plugin on some of my channels, which enables me to use external audio effects in a similar way to software effects. I have an outboard compressor, for example, that I prefer to use sometimes. So in my I/O plugin, I prepare the outputs and inputs to make the routing of my outboard gear more efficient. So this will only be relevant for you if you're using any external gear that you want to integrate into Logic. One of the final steps in your mixing process is to check your mix in mono. Therefore, I have a gain plugin on the master output. So in this gain plugin, there's a switch from stereo to mono. As the plugin is added on the stereo output, the entire mix will be switched to mono, which is what we want. Having a final listen in mono will give you important information on whether or not some instruments are getting drowned in the mix. If your mix sounds good in mono, it will sound great in stereo. Mixing in mono is a well-known approach, and I'm not going to elaborate on this in details, but the point is to have this mono switch available on your stereo output as a part of your mixing template. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe. And keep mixing, keep creating music. See you in the next video.